January 30, 1649. A single blow of an axe echoed across London that would change the course of history forever. For the first time in over 1,000 years of English monarchy, a king was executed by his own people. Not in secret. Not in the chaos of battle. But in public, after a trial, with the full weight of law behind it. This wasn't assassination. This was revolution dressed in judicial robes. And the man who walked to the scaffold that freezing winter morning believed, until his very last breath, that he was divinely appointed by God himself to rule. His name was Charles Stuart, King Charles I of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And his death didn't just end a life. It shattered the ancient belief that kings were untouchable, anointed by heaven, beyond the reach of earthly justice. What led to this unprecedented moment? How does a nation put its own king on trial? And what kind of men have the audacity to sign a death warrant for someone they were raised to believe was chosen by God? This is the story of how England killed its king, and in doing so, asked a question that still resonates today. Is anyone truly above the law? To understand why Charles lost his head, you need to understand who Charles was. He became king in 1625, inheriting a throne that came with expectations he was never quite equipped to meet. Charles believed absolutely in the divine right of kings. To him, this wasn't political theory. It was religious truth. God had placed him on the throne, and therefore only God could judge him. Parliament, the common people, the law itself, all of these were beneath him, tools to be used when convenient, dismissed when they became obstacles. This wasn't arrogance in Charles's mind. This was the natural order of the universe. But England in the 1600s was changing. Parliament was growing bolder. The gentry and merchants who filled its benches had money, ambition, and a growing sense that they too had rights. They controlled the purse strings, and Charles needed money constantly. Wars were expensive. Royal courts were expensive. And Charles had a taste for both. So began a dance that would last decades. Charles would demand money. Parliament would demand concessions. Charles would make promises, then break them the moment he had what he needed. Parliament would refuse funds. Charles would dissolve Parliament and rule without them. In 1629, Charles did something that seemed brilliant to him and catastrophic to everyone else. He simply stopped calling Parliament altogether. For 11 years, he ruled England alone. No Parliament. No debate. No compromise. Just Charles, his advisors, and his unshakable belief in his divine authority. He raised money through every creative and legally dubious method he could find. Old feudal taxes were resurrected. Fines were imposed for violations of forgotten laws. Ship money, a tax traditionally levied only on coastal towns during wartime, was suddenly demanded from the entire country during peacetime. People grumbled. They paid. What choice did they have? The king was the king. But resentment built like pressure in a sealed vessel. And Charles, isolated in his conviction, never saw the explosion coming. His biggest mistake, the one that would ultimately cost him everything, came when he tried to force his religious views on Scotland. Charles loved ceremony, ritual, high church tradition. The Scots were Presbyterian, deeply Protestant, suspicious of anything that smelled remotely Catholic. When Charles attempted to impose a new prayer book on Scottish churches in 1637, the response was immediate and violent. Riots erupted. The Scots formed an army. And suddenly, Charles needed Parliament again. He needed their money to fight a war. Parliament, summoned after 11 years of silence, was in no mood to be cooperative. They had grievances, long lists of them, accumulated over a decade of being ignored. They wanted reforms. They wanted guarantees. They wanted to clip the king's wings permanently. Charles tried to play the game, making concessions he had no intention of keeping. But this time, Parliament wasn't backing down. Tensions escalated. Pamphlets flooded London, some defending the king, others calling him a tyrant. The country was dividing, choosing sides, preparing for something nobody wanted to name out loud. Then, in January 1642, Charles made a catastrophic error. He personally led armed men into the House of Commons to arrest 5 members of Parliament he considered troublemakers. It was an unprecedented violation. The king, with soldiers, invading the sanctuary of Parliament itself. The 5 men had been warned and fled. Charles found empty seats. Legend says he muttered that the birds had flown. But what he'd really done was demonstrate to everyone watching that he would use force to get his way. That he saw Parliament not as a partner but as an enemy to be crushed. Trust, already fragile, shattered completely. By August 1642, England was at war with itself. Not a rebellion. Not a riot. A civil war. King against Parliament. Royalists against parliamentarians. Father against son. Brother against brother. Towns split down the middle. It was a war nobody thought would last long. Surely, reason would prevail. Surely, compromise would be found. It lasted 7 years. Thousands died. Battles raged across the English countryside, turning fields into graveyards. And slowly, painfully, Parliament's forces, led by men like Oliver Cromwell, began to win. By 1646, the war was effectively over. Charles had lost. His armies were defeated, scattered, or surrendered. He was a king without power, a commander without troops, a ruler whose kingdom had rejected him. But here's the thing about Charles. He never accepted defeat. Not really. Even as a prisoner, even with his options dwindling, he still believed God would deliver him. He still believed he was in the right. And so he kept scheming, kept negotiating, kept playing both sides against each other, certain that eventually his enemies would fracture and he'd be restored to full power. Parliament tried to negotiate with him. Multiple times. They offered compromises. They sought a settlement that would keep Charles as king but limit his powers, create a constitutional monarchy where Parliament held real authority. Charles smiled, nodded, signed agreements, and then immediately began plotting to escape and restart the war. He played Parliament against the army. He courted the Scots, promising them religious concessions if they'd invade England on his behalf. He was a prisoner writing secret letters, making secret deals, refusing to accept the reality that his time was over. In 1648, the king's machinations bore bitter fruit. The Second Civil War erupted. Royalists rose again. The Scots invaded as Charles had hoped. And men who had already buried friends, who had already fought and bled and thought the nightmare was over, had to take up arms again. This second war was shorter but more brutal. The anger was deeper now. The parliamentary forces crushed the uprisings with a vengeance. And when it was over, when the last royalist army surrendered and the Scottish invaders limped home, something fundamental had changed. The army, the men who had actually done the fighting, were done negotiating. They were done with Charles making promises he'd never keep. They were done with parliamentary moderates who still dreamed of reconciliation. The soldiers and their leaders, men like Oliver Cromwell and Henry Ireton, came to a radical conclusion. There would be no peace while Charles lived. He had proven, again and again, that he couldn't be trusted. That he'd restart the war the moment he saw an opening. That thousands more would die if he remained alive and available as a figurehead for future rebellions. The king, they decided, had to answer for the blood he'd spilled. But how do you put a king on trial? There was no legal framework for it. The very concept violated everything English law and tradition stood for. Kings were sovereign. They embodied the law. They couldn't be subject to it. It was like asking water to flow uphill. Impossible. Absurd. And yet, the army was determined. They needed legal cover, a veneer of justice, something that would make this look like law rather than simple revenge. The army purged Parliament. In December 1648, soldiers stood at the entrance to the House of Commons and physically prevented moderate members, anyone who might oppose trying the king, from entering. What remained was called the Rump Parliament, a fraction of the original body, but one willing to do what the army wanted. They passed an ordinance creating a High Court of Justice specifically to try Charles Stuart for high treason and other high crimes. The House of Lords refused to approve it. Their approval was simply ignored. This court would exist because the army and the Rump Parliament said it would exist. 135 commissioners were appointed to serve as judges. Many refused to participate. Some fled London entirely rather than be associated with what was coming. Others simply didn't show up. When the trial finally began on January 20, 1649, only 68 commissioners were present. They sat in Westminster Hall, that great medieval chamber where English kings had held court for centuries. Now it would host something unprecedented. Charles was brought in. He wore black, except for the silver star of the Order of the Garter on his cloak, a reminder of his royal status. He looked around the hall with something between contempt and disbelief. He refused to remove his hat, a deliberate insult in an age where such gestures mattered. The president of the court, a lawyer named John Bradshaw, sat on a raised platform. Even Bradshaw was afraid. He wore a reinforced hat, concerned that a royalist in the gallery might take a shot at him. The charges were read. Charles Stuart was accused of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the Commonwealth of England. He had, the indictment claimed, wickedly designed to erect an unlimited and tyrannical power, and to overthrow the rights and liberties of the people. He had levied war against Parliament and the kingdom. The blood of thousands was on his hands. Charles refused to plead. He refused to recognize the court's authority. By what legal authority, he demanded, do you bring the King of England to trial? Show me your legal precedent. Show me the law that permits this. His point was valid. There was no precedent. There was no law. This court was an invention, created for one purpose, to judge one man. But Charles's refusal to engage was also his fatal tactical error. If he didn't plead, the court could enter a default conviction. His guilt would be assumed. 3 times over 3 sessions, Bradshaw asked Charles to enter a plea. 3 times Charles refused, launching instead into speeches about divine right and the illegitimacy of the proceedings. He was eloquent, defiant, absolutely convinced of his righteousness. The spectators, carefully selected but still containing royalist sympathizers, murmured support. One woman shouted that Cromwell was a traitor. She was dragged out. The court heard testimony. Witnesses described seeing Charles on battlefields, commanding troops against his own people. Evidence was presented of his letters, his negotiations, his attempts to bring foreign armies onto English soil. Charles was never allowed to cross-examine witnesses. He wasn't permitted to mount a proper defense because he refused to acknowledge the court had any right to try him. It was legal theater, the outcome predetermined, but it followed the forms of law meticulously. On January 27, 1649, the court delivered its verdict. Guilty. Charles Stuart was convicted of high treason and other high crimes. The sentence was death. 59 commissioners signed the death warrant. 59 names on a document that would forever mark them as regicides, king killers. Some signed eagerly. Others hesitated, their hands shaking as they put pen to paper, knowing they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Oliver Cromwell reportedly signed with a flourish, even joking with another commissioner, flicking ink on his face. For Cromwell, this was necessary. For England's future, the king had to die. Charles spent his final days with dignity. He was allowed to see his youngest children, 13-year-old Elizabeth and 8-year-old Henry. The meeting was heartbreaking. Elizabeth later wrote that her father told her they would kill him, and that she should not grieve too much because it was a glorious death he would die. He told young Henry that he must not allow himself to be made king while his older brothers lived. The boy, terrified and confused, promised. Charles gave away his few remaining possessions, wrote letters, prayed. January 30th dawned cold and clear. Charles dressed carefully. He wore 2 shirts, worried that if he shivered from cold, observers might think he was trembling with fear. He walked through London surrounded by soldiers, their drums beating constantly to prevent him from giving a final speech to the crowds. He was taken to the banqueting house in Whitehall, the same building where he'd once hosted elaborate masques and celebrations of royal power. Ironic that it would be the site of his death. The scaffold had been built outside, draped in black. The executioner and his assistant wore masks and disguises. No one wanted to be known as the man who killed the king. The axe was sharp, tested and ready. Charles stepped out onto the scaffold. A crowd had gathered, held back by lines of soldiers, but present nonetheless. History was happening, and London had come to witness it. Charles was finally allowed to speak, though only those immediately on the scaffold could hear him. He addressed the small group around him, knowing his words would be recorded and published later. He insisted he was dying a martyr for the people. He claimed he'd always wanted their liberty and freedom, but that liberty and freedom consists in having government, not in having a share in government. That was never their right. Even now, facing death, Charles couldn't let go of his conviction that common people had no business governing themselves. He forgave his executioners, saying they were instruments of God's will, not truly responsible for what they did. He prayed briefly. Then he tucked his long hair under a white cap so it wouldn't interfere with the axe. He asked the executioner if the block was secure. He lay down, stretched out his arms as a signal. The axe fell. One blow. Clean. Final. A groan rose from the crowd, a sound witnesses described as unlike anything they'd ever heard. Horror, shock, perhaps even immediate regret from some. The executioner lifted the severed head, as tradition demanded, but reportedly didn't speak the customary words, "This is the head of a traitor." The silence was heavier than any proclamation. England was now a republic. The monarchy was abolished. The House of Lords was abolished. England became the Commonwealth, governed by Parliament and the army. For 11 years, England would exist without a king. Oliver Cromwell would eventually become Lord Protector, wielding power that looked suspiciously monarchical despite the republican titles. And when Cromwell died and his son proved incapable of holding the regime together, the English would invite Charles's son back from exile and restore the monarchy in 1660. But something had changed forever. The restored King Charles II would rule more carefully than his father. He remembered what happened to kings who pushed too hard. The myth of divine right had been punctured by an axe on a January morning. The idea that a king could be held accountable, could be tried, could be executed for crimes against his people, that idea was now loose in the world. It terrified monarchs across Europe. It inspired revolutionaries for centuries to come. The 59 men who signed Charles's death warrant faced different fates. When the monarchy was restored, those still alive were hunted down. Some were executed, hanged, drawn, and quartered with medieval brutality. Some fled to exile and died abroad. Others were imprisoned for life. Oliver Cromwell himself, already dead, was exhumed, his corpse hanged in chains, then beheaded. His head was stuck on a pike outside Westminster Hall for 24 years. The Restoration government wanted to send a message. Regicide would be punished, even posthumously. But they couldn't undo what had been done. They couldn't erase the memory that a king had stood trial, been found guilty, and paid with his life. Legal scholars still debate the legitimacy of that trial. It violated every principle of English law as it existed in 1649. It was a political act dressed in judicial robes. The judges were the king's enemies. The outcome was decided before the first word of testimony. By any modern standard, it was a show trial. And yet, it asked questions that needed asking. Is a ruler responsible for the suffering caused by their decisions? Can a leader commit crimes so grave that their position doesn't protect them? Where does sovereignty truly reside, with the person wearing the crown or with the people they govern? These questions didn't start with Charles's trial, but his execution gave them weight, gave them consequence. Blood had been spilled over principles, not just power. The trial of King Charles I remains one of the most controversial events in British history. To some, it was justified tyrannicide, the necessary removal of a ruler who had betrayed his people repeatedly and refused every chance at peaceful resolution. To others, it was judicial murder, a crime against law and tradition that stained England's honor. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps that's why it still fascinates us centuries later. History rarely gives us clear heroes and villains. Charles believed absolutely in his cause, died bravely for his convictions, and also bore responsibility for thousands of deaths in wars he prolonged through stubbornness and duplicity. His judges believed they were serving justice and England's future, and also twisted law beyond recognition to achieve a predetermined outcome. Everyone believed they were right. Everyone paid a price. If you found this story as fascinating as we do, share it with someone who loves history. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the moments that shaped our world. And drop a comment below. Do you think the trial was justice or murder? Were Charles's judges heroes or criminals? History doesn't give easy answers, but it gives us the questions worth asking. Thanks for watching.